Yeah. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the weekly show of What is School For? This show is inspired by my dear mentor and Seth Golden. And on this show, I interview education leaders, entrepreneurs, business owners, parents, students, people from all walks in life to come here to discuss, debate, and disrupt education. The goal is to not blame, but to future-proof the next generation, to give our listeners, our viewers some tips, guidance that they can apply right now to make homeschooling or educating their children a lot more easier and effective and efficient. So today we are talking about the future, learning for the future, what to learn, how should we show up, how to be prepared for a future that we don't even know yet, right? The future is unfolding and we are getting prepared to be prepared for that future and how to be prepared. And I have the best guest of honor to join me live, David Culberhouse. Is that how to say your last name?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So David I have been stalking, before I went live, I told David, I have been stalking David on Twitter for quite some time. And I love his insight on education, on leadership. And David is a distinguished and a veteran educator and taught in the classroom for quite a few years and also served as an admin and also served as a principal. And there's so much that we can learn from David. And second, I'll be sharing David's Twitter handle. You guys should definitely follow him on Twitter and just every day nuggets of information and wisdom regarding education and the future and what should we do today to be prepared for the future. So that is kind of the focus for our discussion today. And we are live on LinkedIn, on Periscope, on YouTube, and on Facebook. So if you are live with us right now on a Friday, and David is on the West Coast, so super early for him. Thank you so much. So if you are live with us right now, let me know in the comment section where you are joining us live from, and let's join the conversation and discuss the future. So David, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I've seen all the distinguished guests you have, so I feel a little ill-equipped to meet that, but I appreciate you having me on today, and it'll be fun to have the conversation. It's understanding that we don't have answers, but we can dig into some questions. And the more that we look at questions, I think the better we start to think about where we're moving towards in the future.
Totally, making the right questions and asking the right questions. I think that's a very key stepping point into the future, right? So please add something to my very brief introduction of who you are and what you do.
Right now, I work at the county office in San Bernardino County, work with a wonderful team. And so through the year, I think I've been in education probably close to 28, 29 years. I've been a teacher
It's incredible.
At various levels. I've been a program specialist, an elementary administrator, which is like an assistant principal. I've been a principal and now at the county office. So a lot of my work right now is more with the adults and the educational leaders, but still a lot of teaching. Yeah.
I'm so excited. I think everyone, we have quite a few people with us right now. Let me know, everyone, where you guys are joining us live from. And I'm so excited. I can't wait to learn from you. And you have so much to offer. So you mentioned you have been in the education space for almost 3 decades, double how much time I spent in the education space. So share with us, what are some changes and trends that you have observed within the last 3 decades?
And so, when I think about it, I've seen it. How should I say this? When you went back in education, going back to when I first started, it was a very different feeling. Even the way that we work to get students ready for work and the workforce, there was a much more of a variety of what kids could fall into. So if you decided not to go to college, there was a lot of jobs out there for you. If you decided to go to college, it was really kind of the ladder that you've moved towards. And so over the last 5 years, I think you now have seen this really huge exponential shift as you've watched. And just to throw this in, for me, this pandemic and this crisis has accelerated what we saw coming anyways. We saw it coming from what was coming with artificial intelligence, with automation, and we saw that more of a slow disruption. You know, I always like to say when I used to go to Sam's Club or Costco, there used to be like 10 cashiers. And then a few years later, there was 6, and then there was 4, and now there's 2. And so it was kind of a slow disruption. But what I've seen recently is that as educators, our job was really just to get kids to have that deep content knowledge when they walked out, and then the workforce would help them prepare for whatever they needed. And I think over the last 5 years or so, you've seen that kind of flip of the workforce is saying you need to show up with the skills, and just reading, writing, and doing math is no longer enough. It's both having that knowledge and those skill sets, and it's also asking for us as educators to really look at what the workforce is now, because you know, and I'm dealing with this as I have a senior in high school who's going into college, and I have to be much more aware of the marketplace and how to help guide them, because now you're having kids leave high school, go to college, come out of college, and not knowing the workforce and the changes that have happened, or walking out into a space where there's not jobs that they're hoping to get. I talk to kids who, I go into Starbucks all the time, and I ask them, why are you, do you have a degree? And a lot of times they say yes. And I say, why are you working here? And they say, there's just not much out there for me. And so in some ways, that's really shifted our job as educators to understand that bridge between education and work, because it's not our job to get kids just ready for work, but it is our job to get kids ready for the jobs that they really need to be prepared for.
Oh, I love this. You just mentioned so many great points, and I so agree with you. Actually, I want to share my screen real quick, because yesterday I was really excited that I actually got this new feature on LinkedIn. So I did a really quick survey, and this is what I asked people. I mean, it's not a big sample. I asked people, what do you think are some of the top concerns, as a parent or an educator getting prepared for the future for our children. So you can see, right, so many people voted, and those who voted feeling prepared is definitely the minority. So most parents feel like, their children are not being prepared, especially some of those really important life skills and skills, as you mentioned. I so agree with you. So specifically speaking, what do you think are some of the important missing links in today's education space, talking about, shrinking or bridging the gap between what is happening in the classroom and what is actually happening in real life?
And when you start to look at it, there's tons of bright spots all over the place. The thing is trying to get it to a scale where there are a plethora of educators who are really working on this idea of deep learning, teaching kids how to be more curious and to tap into different connections, and to learn how that just being the best remember is not going to get me a job anymore. It's about how do I take that kind of learning and how do I connect it in different ways so that when I go out, I can be much more of a problem solver. And so you're seeing that all over the place, but you're also seeing in some places it's still very worksheet based, and there's places where that idea of deeper learning still need to be evolved. And so in many ways, I think it's really looking at from classroom to classroom, how do we scale up these understandings and really start to think about how we best prepare kids to not just be prepared for work, but be prepared to be a better citizen, to be a better thinker, to remain curious, to have wonder, because one of the things I was reading this morning was that curiosity is really it's a passion. and it shows passion. When people are curious, when I'm curious, when someone says a term like deeper learning, my job then is to go find out, what does that actually mean? And so what you need is that curiosity coming back to the adult so it can cascade down into the classroom.
Oh, I so agree. I so agree. I think, in fact, we already have some great questions from the live audience. Thank you so much. We'll ask your questions in a second. I think you talk about this in one of your books, talking about curiosity. And I think curiosity, imagination, creativity, they're all kind of in the same camp. And so much research has shown that as our children grow older, or even just in our society in general, there is a steady decline in creativity and innovation, and since the 90s. And I wonder, why do you think that is the case? And what is wrong with today's education? Like, I think most educators, we are like, our intention, like school leaders, our intention is to keep that level of curiosity, creativity, and imagination. So what happens, as we grow older, not just in the classroom, but in the corporate, in the business environment? Why do you think there's a decline? And what can we do to keep the creativity, innovation level up?
And if you, and I know you've read a lot of my work, you notice I focus a lot on leadership. And as you watch that decline, you also see that the decline happens as children get older, and then it gets even more as we become adults. And I think a lot of times people will say that we kind of pull back from being creative and innovative because a lot of it gets pushed out of us because we've become very answer focused, and very answer driven in how we just approach our organizations. And so one of the things that people have a tendency to think is that people won't be creative and innovative because they're scared of failing. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I think people become more averse to it because of how leaders react when failure happens, and also how their colleagues react in that idea of judging others. And there can be a real negative organizational culture towards not being just creative and innovative, but what happens when it doesn't work out the way you hoped it was going to work out. And so I think the one thing that you really have to start to think about as a leader, if you want those kind of classrooms, if you want those kind of schools, districts, cultures, you have to build a sense of, and a lot of times people will say, well, build trust. But trust is a little bit vague. So I like the idea of psychological safety, of building a space where people feel like, I can say things, I can try things, and I won't be judged for it. I won't be treated differently. But it's understanding that the failure is now a new starting place to move forward in a different way. And too often, people get judged when it doesn't work out. And then what happens is your organization becomes creative and innovatively risk adverse.
Oh, I so agree with you. It's such a great point. That's why, like at my own little school, we really make an effort to celebrate mistakes. That is a core part of our classroom culture. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I actually just finished watching a training course on creativity. And so the person gave the training was saying that, for people to have those creative ideas, if you ask someone to share an idea, this person will, hey, like, how can you redesign a coffee cup, for example, right? So the first 10 ideas will be kind of like, okay, creative, and then you will lose that energy. So for the energy to come back, for the creative energy to come back, you really have to have some of those so-called stupid ideas. And either from you or from another person, someone mentioned, oh, have you ever thought about that? Even though it sounds really stupid. And that's how you go back the curve. It's almost like a bell curve, like creative ideas decrease. And then for the curve to go back to the top level, is like through some stupidity, stupid ideas. So it just reminds me of that, which I so agree. I think, as teachers and parents, will have to think about how can we create that psychological safety. Yeah.
And it goes back to what we were talking about in the very beginning of, it's as much about content and skills, and how do you bridge those tensions together. I think it's the same thing when you look at being more creative and innovative, is there's this tension of sometimes in an organization, they can be all divergent or they can be all convergent. And the problem is that one way or the other causes a disequilibrium. If you're all divergent, all you do is you're chasing everything. So pretty much you're herding cats. And if you're all convergent, you take the first idea, that's what we're rolling with. And we haven't really looked at a diversity of ideas. And it's spending time to get into that divergent thinking where you get that plethora of ideas and then saying, okay, now how do we converge down? And, you know, your design thinkers would kind of call that your flaring and focus, And sometimes we just have a tendency to choose one or the other because we don't believe we have time, and that limits, I think, the possibilities that we're creating for a better future.
Totally. And here's this great question from Pam. Thank you for joining us live. And she said that it seems like the school, at least the traditional school framework, really discourages failures, and with this really heavy emphasis on scores, exams. Like, you know, you also talk about this a little bit, David, you know, like answer. We become so answer focused. In fact, one important reason I resigned from my teaching position was, like, I feel like my students, they don't really care about the journey of learning. They care so much, or maybe only, about the answer, right? Like A and score. And I, you know, even last week, I had a conversation with a high school teacher. He's teaching math. And so he shared something similar to my frustration. Like, students and parents, they press the school, they press the pressure, the teacher, you know, like academic performance, like A's, and get to this. So, like, what do you think about that? You know, is that detrimental to our children's creativity, imagination, and, you know, becoming future ready? And what can we do from the school level? I know you are very high level there. So, like, even at the policy level, what should we do to be part of the solution?
I think what's going to happen is, in some ways, what's happened over the last 9 weeks or so here has really opened up some doors for people to think quite differently about, you know, what is the future of school? How does that look different? We've had to weigh a lot of issues, and not only from those compliance issues, but also equity issues. And so these are going to cause, I think, some really deep thinking of, as we start to think about this new school year, you're going to have to think very differently of what it looks like. And too often we get, and it goes back to that tension again. We go back to, it's going to be all compliance, or it's going to be all creativity, or all implementation and all innovation. I think there needs to be a kind mix between the two, and being able, especially as school leaders, and district leaders, to weigh that tension of how do we move forward in the way that we will have certain compliance issues, certain implementation issues, but how do we do that in a more creative and innovative way? How do we start to think of new scenarios for the future as we start to look at what school is going to look like in a way that it becomes much more focused, not on doing education, but understanding it's about learning. And a lot of times the system has gotten to a place where kids are just doing education, and learning becomes kind of the thing that falls to the back seat, where it should be the other way around. Especially as you connect back to the world of work, they're going to look for people who come out with new and novel ideas, who can think differently, who can solve problems that we haven't even started to think about. And if all we've done is create good test takers, we're finding that they're falling short in that kind of environment.
Well, it's so refreshing to hear that from you, an education leader. That has given me so much hope. And in fact, prior to our conversation right now, this morning, I had a conversation with another gentleman, an entrepreneur who is actually coming to my next show on Wednesday. So he shared with me a really personal story. He said that when he was in Canada, he was going to university. He was taking classes, a business school class. He was in the classroom. And so the teacher was teaching something business related. So after the class, this is the fun part, everyone. So after the class, and he actually walked up to the professor and asked the professor, hey, what business do you run? Like, what is your business? And guess what the professor mentioned? He said that I wrote this book. And then he said, is this a book based on a business? And then the professor got really pissed off, like thinking that he is challenging his authority. Then that was kind of the trigger for him. He shared with me this morning. He never walked back. So like I'm just like I see this comment from like Pam, which is relevant to what I just shared with you and everyone. She asked, do you see the need for building more partnerships between school and real life like businesses and companies to expose our students so that they can learn not only from academics, so to speak, which is important, but also to learn from like practitioners, like professors or teachers teaching, for example, business, but also actually run a business. Not like they used to run a business, but they are still running a business. So what do you think about that?
What I'm really seeing is some of the districts that are really pushing forward are reaching out. They're creating internships. They're creating partnerships with businesses and entrepreneurs, and they're giving kids the opportunity to go out and try some things that are jobs that they might not ever have heard of, so that they start to see, you know, kids. And it goes back to the first question. One of the early questions you asked is, when I was a kid, they said, you know, you could be an athlete or a police officer or a firefighter. And then they really didn't say a whole lot after that. And really, when you start to look now, the whole idea of work's changed in some incredible ways. And so giving kids opportunities to get out there and explore and try some things out actually allows them to have a better perspective going into college, if that's what they decide to do, or if they decide to go the career pathway, knowing what's expected and what they need to learn. And so those kind of things, you know, even our county office has, you know, done the cybersecurity training for students. My son, who's a high school senior, he went through with the adults, and he's A+ certified. And so giving kids those opportunities, because he loves, I mean, he's been accepted as a Microsoft developer. He's phenomenal with technology. Yeah. But going through that, cybersecurity was something, because we know there's so many jobs out there that it might have been a career pathway for him. But as he was going through it, there was parts of it that he didn't find terribly exciting. So it's looking at those opportunities so that kids don't go into a pathway that maybe is not, it might feel passionate at the time, but they learn that there's no other avenues through that. And so a lot of districts are really starting to open up in those ways and give kids different opportunities to kind of explore those chances to see what the world of work is really like.
I really love that. I kind of see this comment from Dan. Thank you for joining us live. You know, I think definitely it's a lot of work to just ask educators, you know, not only you have to do academic publication, you also have to become a practitioner. I feel like it should be a collective effort, right? Effort from the teachers, of course, from the parents, from the community, from companies like Microsoft and different companies, and maybe even like local small businesses to be a part of this. You know, the old saying, it takes a village to raise the next generation. I so agree. It's not only the teacher's job, you know, so many parents, they just outsource their children's education. So I see quite a few questions and comments related to distance learning. And I wonder, in your book, and what should we do to make learning, especially online learning, that is what everyone is doing right now, more effective? I asked this question also because I have been teaching online classes for quite a few years, and my personal experience tells me teaching online classes is definitely not easier compared to teaching traditional face-to-face classes. So share some tips with us, like what should teachers do and what can parents do? And children, what should our students do to make this learning more effective?
And that's a really difficult question, because I facilitate for the National Institute of School Leadership. And so we went from doing really in-depth face-to-face trainings with educational leaders to now doing this virtually. and it's a huge shift, and you really have to and I'm going to throw this in. Yesterday, our governor here in California was doing the May revision that discussed the budget. And one of the things that I loved was he said, as we approach this and all of the complexity that we're dealing with, you have to have a beginner's mindset. And so, it's great to hear that, even our political leaders are starting to understand, as we face these adaptive challenges, you can't overlay the way we solve technical problems, because these are dilemmas. And so the one way I've looked at it over the last couple of weeks is years and years ago, I started playing ice hockey. And I was an adult at the time, and I wanted to play once I became a teacher. And when I first started, I couldn't really play the game because all I thought about was how to skate. And so once I finally learned how to skate, then I could be more creative in playing the game. And so a lot of times, when we look right now, in many facets of this, there's some people who are doing phenomenal online work and have been for a long time. And there's some people who have come on new who are doing incredible things with kids and adults online to support their learning. But there's still a lot of people who are learning how to skate. So as they start to learn, I believe that they can start to be more creative. And you start to hear people talking about, how do we work in social and emotional learning? How do we make this more of an equitable space? How do we look at providing kids, Wi-Fi in different ways in our communities? So what you're starting to see is more, I think, divergent thinking as we start to look at where this is all going, because I don't believe we think, even if school starts in a regular face-to-face, it's going to be very different. Our governor has discussed, staggered times, possibly social distancing as you come back to school. And so there's a lot of things, especially for your school leaders and your teachers, to say, so what does that look like? How do we start to picture a scenario of, if it goes this way, how can we do this very effectively if it goes this way? And so building those alternative scenarios and really starting to think around the corner right now will be very helpful as we kind of wrap up this school year and start to think about what does the fall bring us. But the more the parents can be involved and spend time talking to their kids, and the one thing that I talked about before we even went to this place is that change in society right now is in many ways very exponential. It's moving at a pace that even business can't keep up with, let alone education. So you're really going to have to think about, how do I support my own child of being ready for a world that's moving at a much more accelerated rate?
Yeah, I love this. I love so many great points. And so here's a quick question from Zizi. Thank you for joining us. Well, what district? I think I missed it. You mentioned that earlier.
Just what districts are doing?
I think where you are working, the district you are working with.
Oh, well, at the county office where I work, we work with 33 districts in our county. Okay. But we also then work with the other county offices around us. What you've seen over the last couple of years since we went to local control and accountability plans and that whole process, you're starting to see geo leads in California. Now we're collaborating in different ways across counties. We're collaborating with districts in and outside of our county. So you're seeing much less of a siloed approach in California to, I would say, a much more collaborative way of looking at and saying, okay, in San Bernardino County, you have a real knack for stakeholder engagement. So when other districts in California need that support, they can go to you. If you look over in Riverside County or San Diego County, San Diego is really great with the improvement science work. So they're taking a lead on that. So they're not only collaborating more, they're saying, look, let's focus in on what you're really good at and allow other people to tap into that, which is, I think, a very more positive approach to how we're looking at it through a state level.
Definitely, I hope can keep it up. Yeah. So yeah, in one of your blog articles, and you talk a lot about the future. I really love this statement that you mentioned in the article. Too often we view the future as a noun, as opposed to be throwing this verb lens. So what do you mean by that? Explain that statement to us.
I think what I was trying to get at is that we have this tendency to think that, okay, so here comes the future. Let's just take it and see what we can do. And it's very reactive of here it comes, let's do something. Here it comes, let's do something. Instead of saying, how do we get around the corner? And it's much more of a futurist kind of viewpoint of saying, how do we start to think around the corner and start to forecast as we look at what's happening in society and the world around us, what's changing with the digital disruption and all those shifts and their effect that'll have on work will eventually have effect on education. Instead of approaching it with that reactive stance is, how do we move out of survival mode and being reactionary to being much more, I like to call it future casting, of really forecasting the future, because you can't predict it, but you can start to think about, as we look around us, we can see where things are starting to happen, where things, the pandemic kind of caught us all kind of, in a very quick and surprising way, but we also saw all of that coming through automation and AI anyways. So we could have been preparing and saying, okay, look, here's some of the dilemmas we're facing. How do we start to think about what are some scenarios and ideas of a future we would like to have? And then how do we backwards map it and start working towards that, but allowing us time to adapt and iterate as new information comes to us. A lot of times we plan and we say we're going to do this, and then things change, but we don't use that data to make shifts or pivot. And so it's really starting to think about, and I love the term the military uses, it, they call it commander's intent. Commander's intent is that idea that here's where we want to be. This is the objective we're after. But we also know when everyone hits the ground, whether that's a classroom or this, everyone's going to have to adapt. So instead of getting everyone to try and walk in the same path, it's understanding that for your class to get to this objective, you might have to go this way, or you might have to go that way. So allowing people and building up the autonomy and the capacity so that they can adapt while still understanding, hey, this is what we're trying to get to.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And definitely lots of positive signs and like guidance for us. And so I love this quite common. Actually, I think I see Alice mentioned something similar, how unprepared we were. So I hope through this pandemic and it serves as a wake-up call, like be prepared for this. As you mentioned earlier, David, really accelerates this. And from my personal experience of working with some schools and even my own children, they took some online classes. Some of the classes, they were so bad. And I think sometimes people think that online learning means that you just make everything, from a hard copy and make that into an e-copy, and they call that online learning. And it is so unfortunate. There's so much more involved. So I hope, this pandemic can wake people up, slowly catching up. Lots of training from investment from school leaders. Yeah. So you're
Can I add something to that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
The one thing is, because I know it was mentioned that we were unprepared, but it wasn't across the board. And so it's really, in every organization, there's people who have already solved the problem. And sometimes we tend to just look outside. It's really starting to look inside. And what I like to call it is the positive deviance or the bright spots, is trying to find out who are those people who have already solved the problem, and how do we look at some of those behaviors and things that they're doing and start to scale that so that we can utilize that to say, hey, we have people who are doing this with the same resources in the same environment. How do we actually scale that to show some ways that we were prepared in certain areas, and how do we get better prepared for the future?
Yeah, definitely. And here is a big idea question here. Where's the question? Yeah. What is learning in the 21st century? That's his big question. What is learning? So what is learning in the 21st century, and what is learning? Actually, I have some similar questions. I wonder, because we're talking about the future, right? And what get us here will not get us there. So talking about the future, one of my favorite quotes is from Alvin Toffler, a futurist. And he said that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. So I really love that process of learning, unlearning, and relearning. So kind of like reflecting on what we have already shared so far. So David, what do you think are some of the old practices that we absolutely need to unlearn, deconstruct if we need to move to the future? And then we talk about this big question, or if you want to answer this big question first, what is even learning? Do we need to involve some sort of unlearn, relearn, and redefine learning in the 21st century?
Well, the good thing is no one's throwing any softballs at me today. So, but when I look at it, I think the mindset you have to approach it with is that, and I'll throw in like, I love Cotter's work in Accelerate, is that, is creating this dual operating system. And it's understanding that the old hierarchical systems just don't go away, but you also have to have a more innovative side that can press into that very hierarchical side. And so when you start to think about that, you have to start to consider not everything changes, but not everything stays the same. And it's really starting to think about what kind of shifts do we have to make. I think the one thing that this is really pointed out, and it's funny because how long ago was this? About over 15 years ago, when I was in a district, I used to do classes on emotional intelligence. Mm-hmm. And so parents loved it. It was more for the parents. And then I started being asked to do it for teachers at schools too. And the one thing that had concerned me recently, and that's not to say it's not important, because it's incredibly important, is that when I would hear social and emotional learning, it would just go to trauma informed. Mm. And so it's understanding that there's a safety support part to social and emotional learning, and there's also this viable, important 21st century kind of learning part that goes to it too, of being socially aware, building up your emotional intelligence. Because before this all happened, you could see more and more businesses saying, look, we're looking for kids who can walk out not only with technical skills, but those social skills. And we were kind of living in a time where those had kind of been pushed away because we don't have time for it, because it was really about the learning and the content, and not understanding that actually that social and emotional side is going to be hugely important to being effective in the 21st century. And you're seeing it even more now, because it's even more difficult to relay that in this kind of setting, because it's harder and it wears on your cognitive load more too, to look in the screen and say, what are your facial expressions? And, and what am I reading from you? So it's actually going to require a deeper level, I think, of emotional intelligence moving forward.
Amen. So true. I mean, like I'm personally a big advocate of social emotional learning, and I have read so many reports and are saying that even though we have this increasing demand for AI technology, and surprisingly, there is an even higher demand for human skills. And so I want to actually share this screen real quick. And so you were talking about social emotional learning. So this article is kind of a bit old, but you get the point. So this is published by Harvard Business Review. And so in this article, they were talking about the differences between an ordinary leader and an extraordinary leader. And the difference is actually soft skill, social emotional skill. And this one actually published last year. LinkedIn report, and they talk about 4 major trends are shaping the future. And guess what? Look at this, everyone. Number one is soft skills. It's so I knew it was important, but I didn't know it was 91%. So bring back to the classroom, also homeschooling right now. So what do you think are some ways, what has to be changed of what we need to do to really help our students, especially those who are a bit older and getting ready to like high school and college age. Remember, everyone, quite a few of you joined late. I shared my own survey results. Many parents feel like their children don't have those social, emotional, EQ, life skills. So what can we do to solve this, or at least improve the situation?
Well, and it's funny because I don't have, all the answers, but it's really, thinking about very often when we look at not just school, but organizations as a whole, they can be very siloed. It's that whole rows. We all sit in rows and we do our work, and everything's very answer driven. And when you start to think about how does it build up more of those emotional intelligence skills, it's really having time to move away from just that answer driven way of looking at things to digging into deeper questions and allowing questions to percolate, questions we don't have answers to because that's messy, and then allowing people to dive in and collaborate with each other and have time to talk and get a feel of working together, which is going to be even more difficult during this time, which requires us as parents to spend some time asking our kids questions. And it's hard because we're all caught in this whole idea of time. I don't have enough time. I don't have enough time. And so, instead of asking your child, what did you learn today? What questions did you ask? What things did you explore? What were you curious about? Allows us to build deeper conversations. And sometimes when I'm saying that, those are things that I know I need to work on with my own kids and family because we're so caught up in time. But that is one of the things that we're really facing now, is that our society just became very like calendar driven. It's this, and this. And, and then after school, it was taking kids to this, and this, and then do your homework and go to sleep. And so, one of the things that my wife is really good at is trying to get us to sit down at the table. And used to, when I did those classes 15 years ago, the one thing I said was the microwave was the worst thing that ever happened, because when you have to get around the kitchen in some way or and it's not necessarily a kitchen, but having a place where you have to actually talk. She does that much better than me because I get caught up in everything, but she really tries to slow us down and say, look, we have to talk about our day, engage with our kids, and spend time. And I think that is a good place to start to really build up those social and emotional skills. And then, as teachers and educational leaders, what we're modeling and what we work with in our staff has a tendency to cascade down into the classroom. So we can't just tell people to do it. We actually have to be engaged in that ourselves.
I so agree. That's kind of, I mentioned this quite a few times on my show. I feel like as parents or as leaders, we need to show up not as a dictator, but show us as a facilitator, as a collaborator. We are also part of the learning journey. And I so agree, parents, that's why I think the old model, the sage on the stage model is over, because you fix the teacher as the expert, right? That's a fixated view. But like, we don't know everything. We are also learning because,
Yes.
Today's information is tomorrow's misinformation. Everything is changing so fast. And I see this coming from Rich Carr. Thank you for joining us live. He's talking about activating our children's senses, like watching something, feeling something, having conversation with others, being in the real life environment. And I think if we can bring more of that, through internships, Pam talk about that, I think that will really help like accelerate the learning curve a little bit more. Yeah.
And I'm hoping through this process is we don't want people to think technology is bad, because it's really going to be a part of your future going forward.
Mm-hmm.
But being forced to be in it so much is maybe allowing us to see that it's also important to have the other side too. And it's those tensions of not being all caught up in one or the other, but being able to effectively weigh those tensions of, hey, you know what, now it's time to get off this, and it's time to have some conversations and spend some time together, take a walk together, those kind of things that I think got lost in the speed of how things were going.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that when I interview Duncan Wardle, who is the former VP of Innovation at Disney, he said something really profound also. And he talked to, I think, 5,000 people and asking them where they gained their most creative ideas. Guess what people mentioned? Shower, taking a walk, being in nature, having lunch, having a conversation. Nobody ever mentioned, at work or in front of my computer trying to be creative. So I love that, like also kind of Pam mentioned, we schedule, like as parents we tend to, like sometimes I call myself doing this 8 a.m., 9 a.m., 10 a.m., like every hour is so scheduled, so structured. So from the conversation today and from what you mentioned, I think it's so important to give our children some space, just like maybe not doing anything, but give them space to connect the dots in their brain. So I love that. Yeah.
And going along with that, if you can find a plethora of articles out there. The one thing that we never had time to do was be bored.
Mm-hmm.
And actually boredom leads you to be a little more creative. It's interesting. Things that I didn't see in our neighborhood. There's a little wooded area over off to the side. I never saw kids down there, but once this happened, one afternoon, I'm taking a walk. They're building bike, trails down there and jumps and stuff that, I think we used to do as children because we were bored. We'd get more creative, go outside, explore and do things. And so you're starting to see a little bit of that start to come back because I think our schedules were so packed that there was no time just to be bored, which drove us to be a little more creative.
It's so true. I mean, like I work with older children. I see that, like my younger kids, even if they are bored, they can figure out something to do, keep themselves occupied. Especially my younger one, 5 years old. He's always in his own place. Something's happening, Star Wars, whatever. But my undergraduate students, by the time they're older, and if they have some free time, I give them some freedom, a free class, a free writing, free brainstorming. They have no idea. I think that is I feel like it's a reflection of them being too structured and always giving them do this, do this, do that, and then we're slowly taking away their agency to engage in self-directed learning, self-directed thinking. I don't know. Do you see that or no?
Yeah, and it reminds me of there's a great video on YouTube from the singer from the White Stripes, and he talked about his process for making music, and he would make things harder on himself and create space where he had to have some constraints. And so the one thing I think, nowadays is that even when we get space, we have this tendency to say, okay, so if you could do whatever you want to do, what would you do? And then people go, I don't know. And we do that in meetings. If you could build any school that you wanted to build, if you had everything you wanted, what would you do? And a lot of times you get crickets, because the one thing that pushes that creative thinking is now throw a few constraints on it too. And I love that he talked about that. He said he would make constraints to force himself to be more creative, because if he had everything he needed, then it didn't force him to think differently. And so how do you create some space and within that some constraints? And I think about a lot of times when I would do staff meetings as a principal, you say, okay, so here's what we could do. What would you do? And no one would say anything. But once you said, but we only have $1,500. That's the only resource we have. Oh, then the ideas started coming because you pushed a constraint on and then allowed people to push back. And so it's how do you create some flexible constraints to continually push people? And we're going to have to do that when we start to think about this remote learning and how we think about education. Because I think sometimes we'll just throw out there, well, if you could do whatever you want, what would it be? With all the resources, well, we're probably not going to get all that. So what are some constraints that you can put on it? So if people said, look, you can only do this, this, and this, what would you create? And a lot of times those constraints will push people to be way more creative and innovative in the way they approach any of the problems we start to think about and moving forward.
No, that is so interesting. I never thought about that. Like also resonated with me. Interesting. I thought when you put on some constraints, it may like kind of not like, you know, hinder creativity, but from what you're mentioning is like the opposite. I'm interested in giving this a try.
And think of it as a positive way. It's like if you're in a team setting and there's no positive conflict, you actually haven't created the space to get to better ideas, because usually what people will do is, I don't want to hurt feelings, so I'll just be quiet. But you want people to go, hey, I'm not attacking you. We're attacking the problem to get to better, you know, it's that creative abrasion. How do you get to those places where you can get to better ideas and still feel good about it? It gets back to psychological safety. But the same thing with creativity. You want to put a little bit of a constraint on it, but you want it to be flexible so people can push on that, because it makes you think different. And then you start thinking, how do I get outside of that? You know?
That's interesting. I can kind of maybe relate this in my personal case in this example. And let me know, guys, in the live audience, if you can resonate with me. Almost like when there is a deadline pressuring me to finish a project, I feel like my creative energy is like flowing in me. I don't know if I'm just so strange, and but that's kind of me. When there's like, you have to have this done, or people give me something to do, hey, just take your time, give it to me whenever you finish. I will never even just touch it. I need a deadline to I don't know if that's a bad role model, bad example to share, but that's kind of how I work. And so what you share kind of make me think that way a little bit. Yeah, yeah. So I see that like many of you, I will definitely share the links in the comments, some of the articles that I mentioned earlier, and for sure, yeah. And so we are actually wrapping up our hour here, and I know you have a busy day ahead of time. So like actually I prepared this question, and before we had this conversation on putting some constraints, and I'm still curious to ask you, you know, if you had the autonomy, the budget, and the resources to design an ideal school, what would that school look like to you?
That's such a difficult question. It's one of those. It's one of those ones you think you know until someone actually asks you.
Or maybe some essential elements and that you think should definitely be a part of the, like, you know, the foundation.
Yeah, I think it is going to require us to create a space where we become more curious and more knowledgeable, because a lot of times people will say, well, I'm going to have this technology and that technology. To me, it's really about changing the way we think. A lot of times there's certain things that have gotten lost as we've moved along, things like play. You know, how do we create spaces where, because play we know is vitally important, especially for the, you know, younger children. That's where they learn. And how do you create spaces where they can use play as a vehicle for learning? How do we look at that social and emotional side and build up emotional intelligence so the kids are walking out with those skill sets, not only to be effective in the school setting, but when they leave school? And it's also understanding that and one of the gentlemen that I do the What's Next program that we have, and I think you saw the one that we had coming up. I love that he says is how do you build a portrait of a learner? And so it's how do you create a space where it's not about doing school, but I really actually enjoy the process of learning. And getting to solve some real life problems, and in a way that allows me to feel like and you mentioned this earlier, that I have my own agency, that I'm understood, that, you know, I matter, and what I can add to the world, not only in this space, but beyond this space, is important. And when I think students are in a space like that, it might not even be a matter of the most resources or the most money, but it's when they have that mindset shift where we're scaffolding in ways that every kid comes in with their own understandings, but we can scaffold in a way that they can enter where they need to enter. Because I think we have this idea that every kid's creative and innovative, but you have to build on that. You have to allow them to explore. And it's looking at how do we create a space where they can actually, in a very equitable way, be able to build up those kind of skill sets so that they can walk out into a world and say, okay, look, this is what I want to do, but I also feel I have the agency. If I can't gain it this way, I can gain it that way. And it's that whole idea of deeper learning, expanding that whole educational ecosystem. I know that wasn't the greatest answer, and I was a little all over, but
I love this answer. I think you touch on quite a few very, very important points, which is such a great way to summarize what we discussed today. That sense of like agency. And also, I don't know if Pam is still with us live, and she talks a lot about purpose. And my friend Rich, learning has to be personal. I so agree. We have to help our children find and keep that intrinsic desire to learn. And I like, since we started homeschooling our own children, I saw some really substantial changes in their drive to learn. And it is every teacher's dream that your kid enjoys learning for the sake of learning, because we all know it is the journey that is transforming our children, not the GPA.
Yeah. And it's important that we keep that level of how do we still have wonder and awe around the world? How do we keep ourselves curious?
Amen. And as we have questions with our children, don't just ask, hey, how many A's? Oh, why did you get a B in this class? We don't even explore the journey. If that is the only message we're communicating to our children will feel like, okay, learning is that score. Right? We have to shift how we are talking about learning at home so that they can be prepared for the future. So yeah, this is such a great conversation, everyone. Loved it. Lots of great insights. I will definitely share the links to David's Twitter, which is on the screen. Feel free to connect with David on Twitter. I will also share his blog, website. So many amazing articles and ebooks. Everything's free. You guys can just engage in some binge reading. And I will also share the links to the articles that I mentioned earlier for sure. And so thank you so much, David. Any parting piece of advice and you want to share with us? I think Twitter is the best place for people to connect with you. Is that right?
Yeah, that's usually my best spot. And I just want to thank everyone, because I think we have this tendency to, in this day and age, always look for the negatives. People are adapting in some incredible ways, and you see teachers and educational leaders and even at the state level saying, look, these are adaptive challenges we're facing. They're dilemmas. There's no easy answers for this. And people are digging in and starting to ask questions and say, okay, so how do we adapt? And how do things start to look different? And how do we make a better future? Not only for education, but for our students, our families, our stakeholders. And I think those conversations are going to be deeply important as we start to build some deeper understandings of how this looks in the future.
I love it. Thank you so much for a value-packed hour. I appreciate you, David. I appreciate your time. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us live on Friday. And I appreciate you guys. I hope to see you guys again next Friday. Same time, same location. Have a great weekend. Stay future ready. Bye.
Thank you.